The car industry split over the government's plans to lower vehicle emissions, while the coalition eyes a large-scale nuclear future. The great Australian debate over climate and energy rages on. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. The Albanese Government's latest effort to meet its climate targets is focused on the vehicle industry. It wants to bring Australia into line with the rest of the developed world with a new emissions standard. Under the plan, car makers would have to sell more electric and low emissions vehicles from next year. If they're only selling gas guzzlers, they'd have to pay a price. Consultations closed on Monday night, and unsurprisingly, the industry is split between those who sell diesel utes and those who sell electric cars. The coalition is opposing the whole thing, but this could be a mere skirmish in the bigger debate that's coming. Peter Dutton has confirmed he'll soon announce a policy to roll out large-scale nuclear plants on the sites of old coal generators. The cost is unknown, and the government says it's an idea from fantasy land.
Peter Dutton will outline his policy for nuclear power generation in this country.
I think it's the only credible pathway we have to our international commitments to net zero by 2050.
Nuclear is what everyone's talking about.
It's a nonsense and a fantasy.
This is a nuclear fantasy.
This is just make-believe energy policy.
I look forward to him announcing the locations for nuclear reactors in Australia.
Yeah, we'll be very upfront about every detail of the plan, including location.
Peter Dutton really has become the Mr. Burns of Australian politics.
Excellent.
This fight over the government's fuel efficiency standards is really heating up.
Next one, coming.
I might drive off.
Yeah. Cross that out, and there's your dollar value of how much more it's going to add to the car.
The government shouldn't be applying a new tax to those vehicles to make it look more attractive to buy an electric vehicle.
In no country has the cost of cars gone up as a result. The Liberal Party knows it, I know it, the car companies know it, everyone knows it.
The Thai delegation, or its Prime Minister specifically, might have raised concerns over Australia's so-called ute tax.
There was no request. I had a bilateral meeting. I had a bilateral meeting.
Tesla sensationally quit a key industry lobby group yesterday, claiming it made false and misleading comments about what the policy would mean for car prices.
I welcome the support of Tesla for our efficiency standards.
I suspect that we're probably not far away from Tesla in making some sort of a stand against the FCAI.
The motor dealers at the moment are pushing back very hard on this because they know that new car sales are going to plummet, and as a result they lose jobs in their own industry.
And my guest this morning is the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen. First, let's check what's making news. Canada and Sweden are resuming funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestinian Refugees. It comes weeks after 16 countries paused funds over allegations some UNRWA staff were involved in the October 7 attack by Hamas. Australia is yet to resume funding. The Albanese Government says it wants to be sure the aid will go to those who need it in Gaza. In the 9 newspapers, motorists in outer suburban and regional areas would save as much as $1,800 a year in fuel costs under the government's proposed vehicle emissions standard. That's according to analysis from Chris Bowen's department. It shows those with longer commutes would save the most. It's part of an effort to push back at industry concerns over the new scheme. And finally, the Sunday Age reports an Inner Melbourne council could become the first in Australia to increase parking fees for twin cab utes and large SUVs. Yarra City Council will debate a motion from a Greens councillor aimed at discouraging large and heavy vehicles with proportionate parking fees based on size. Well, we're heading for yet another election where climate and energy will dominate, but the choice for voters will be stark this time. More renewables versus nuclear power. Peter Dutton's policy for large-scale reactors is coming soon. It's unclear whether it will answer some basic questions. What will nuclear cost? Who's paying? When will the reactors be ready? And what's the impact for household bills? The government, meanwhile, is battling to bring down emissions in just one sector. Chris Bowen must now decide whether to stick with the ambition he's laid out in his vehicle emissions standard or scale it back. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Jennifer Hewett, Peter Hartcher and Anna Henderson. Very good morning to all of you. Jennifer, first to you on the vehicle emissions standard. The consultations closed, as I mentioned, Monday night. The industry, you've got the electric car makers who are happy, but the others want some level of change. Are their concerns legitimate?
Well, I'm sure the Minister will disagree with this, but I think they are legitimate, and I do think the risk for the government is that an awful lot of people who now drive Australia's most popular cars, big cars, utes, are going to agree with them. This will obviously be a big kind of campaign for hearts and minds. The question is how quickly and how strict those emission standards will be. Chris Bowen says basically that he wants to change behaviour, and the industry says that's all fine, but we've got to do this gradually. We're coming from a long way back because the coalition never introduced this before, but getting there by 2030, and that time frame he's talking about is a pretty steep one. Yeah, and this is the question: is it too steep? Peter, a lot of countries, nearly every developed country has one of these, but a lot of them started pretty slowly initially.
Well, the first point I'd make is that the coalition ran this up the flagpole in the Dunkley by-election just a couple of week ago. It didn't work. It made no discernible impact. The second point I'd make is that the option that the government has favoured is only one of the options. It's not a firm proposal, and the government says now that the consultation is finished and it's heard all the political positioning and arguments, the government will go away. And I don't know, maybe your guest, Chris Bowen, will clarify this, but I would very much expect that they will amend it. They will make it more moderate to take some of the heat out of the opposition, because it's already a reasonably modest proposal. I think they'll make it even more so and just make it an even smaller political target for Peter Dutton. As I mentioned, Anna, within the industry, you've got this divide. Tesla has now quit the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries. So has Polestar, the other electric car maker. It's had a bit of a crack at the other car makers along the way.
There are some companies that are going to be able to meet these standards, and we can see that there are companies, even those that are suggesting that they can't meet the standards, who are meeting them elsewhere in the world.
They're meeting them elsewhere in the world. Why can't they meet them here, is the point. The Federal Chamber's probably not having the greatest of weeks here with this sort of division. But I guess it was inevitable, wasn't it, with something like this?
When you think about it, it was quite extraordinary for a while that they were working together, really, given their ambitions and where they're leading is so separate. And this issue around how much, the chamber wanted to put out figures and make claims around the cost of cars, how much it would increase, what would happen to consumers, and also this question of whether some car makers might not bring cars into the Australian market anymore, what it might mean for some of the biggest selling vehicles. That's now being seen by the electric vehicle makers as a scare campaign, and so they no longer want to be a part of that process. But the opposition, despite, Peter, what you said about Dunkley, I don't think they think that campaign around the ute tax was not a success. I think they see it as a slow burn, and they're slowly building momentum. They were test driving it, but they still see that there's a lot of accidental.
And don't forget, of course, the electric car makers do make a lot of money. I think
under these sort of schemes. Yeah,
because they sell their credits to the other car makers.
In the US, they've made
up to a third of their money, I think.
Yeah, a couple of $100 million. Look, within the government, I mean, the opposition clearly reckon this is going to be a winner over time for them. But within the government, it's interesting. Labor MPs I talk to don't seem too troubled by it. What are you picking up? Are they worried?
I don't think at this stage they are, because they don't see the impact. As we go on, as time goes on, perhaps there'll be more of a fear in those regional and metro electorates, the sort of outer suburban band where people need to drive their cars, and will become increasingly worried about the impacts if they do believe the figures and if the cut through of the message from the coalition is resonating. But at this point, I think there is a view that there is a real talk here, a reality check on some of these numbers, and the coalition does have to be careful about taking the worst case scenario every time.
Well, just on the cut through message, Jennifer, clearly the coalition, you hear Peter Dutton talking about the impact on the price when you buy the vehicle. It's going to go up thousands of dollars, he says. Chris Bowen is going to be arguing, well, over time you're going to save thousands of dollars, cheaper running costs if you've got a more efficient or even an electric car. How do you think consumers, motorists, are going to weigh up those competing
Well,
arguments?
I think they'll probably be a bit confused by the competing stories on this. But
do you think, it's pretty
think
straightforward to think, yes, an electric's going to cost more, but it will save. I won't have to put petrol in it.
Yeah, that's true, and that is true. That will obviously does save. But the other big issue is that people were yet to be convinced, I think, how they're going to be charging their cars. But everybody lives in apartments, for example, or reliant on public. The charging infrastructure is pretty bad in Australia.
Well, a lot of car parks in apartment buildings, you don't have a power point
can't.
at all.
So I do think there's going to be a whole lot of teething problems here, and the fact that car manufacturers say, by the way, your prices are going to go up, I think will have quite a political impact over time. But I've just come from Western Australia, where every second car seemed to be a big ute or something, and and they're very conscious of WA in Canberra. I think that message will sink in.
Yeah, what do you think, Peter? Is it pay more now but save more over time? Who wins that argument?
Well, they're the competing claims, but I'd probably want to look at the Grattan Institute's study on this, which is non-partisan, independent, and they found that the effect would be to push up prices of new vehicles, but an average of only 1 percentage point.
That's the average, though. What about for the ute?
Well, it would be higher for utes. But look, the constraint here, Australians want electric vehicles. The constraint hasn't been, the days of all the fears of that fear-mongering are over. The constraint hasn't been the electric vehicle technology itself. It is the infrastructure. It's the charging infrastructure.
And the models available.
And the models available. Right. Now, so what the federal government is doing is trying to push, give the whole movement a little nudge along, make electric vehicles more attractive, and this is part of that. This is part of that push. But it really is. The Kiwis can do it. The rest of the whole world can do it. Why can't we?
Yeah.
It is a minor issue. But, when you live for Fight Club, which the opposition does, you're always thinking about the next fight, and you've got to find a fight.
Well, if this is
this is going to get them through for a few weeks.
Sure. If this is a minor issue, the big one, obviously, as I say, that's coming in the next few weeks, apparently, is the nuclear policy from the coalition. Their Shadow Minister, Ted O'Brien, was on Sky News this morning, indicating you might be able to get a nuclear power plant built in Australia within 10 years.
The best experts around the world with whom we've been engaging, Andrew, are saying Australia could have nuclear up and running within a 10-year period.
That would be remarkable, given most of the global evidence on this, Jennifer.
Yeah, good luck with that idea. I think there are going to be very powerful arguments against a nuclear, including the cost and including the time frame and the fact that it's 10 years. Given what we know about Australia, how all projects seem to get very delayed and cost a hell of a lot more than anybody says at first, including of course renewables projects like Snowy Hydro. That is a kind of I think a pipe dream.
Well,
but I
just
think
on that, so there are 5 large-scale reactors, I think, this century in Western Europe and the United States that have been commissioned. One's been pulled because it was too expensive. The other 4 are taking on average more than 20 years to build from announcement to being ready.
So I think this is going to be, you can argue, I think in many ways the nuclear ban in Australia is silly and it's just this kind of weird ideological thing, but it is going to be a very effective scare campaign, I think, from Labor on this. But the bigger issue is that actually it's not going to solve any of our problems until, well over a decade, and we've got a really big problem, particularly with the slowness of the rollout now. And of course we can't, one of the most obvious things to help with that would be gas, but we have trouble enough doing that, let alone nuclear.
So, there's a lot of questions here around nuclear, Peter. The cost, who is going to build it? Will it be taxpayers? Will it be some private investor? On the time frame, if best case scenario it is 10 or 15 years, what happens in the meantime?
Well, the whole point of this policy is, the starting point for this policy is we want to fight. The coalition sees this as perhaps their biggest single winning issue of the last decade. They want to continue it. And the cutting edge of this is the community-based grassroots campaigns to stop new transmission lines crossing farms and other communities. It's against the offshore wind farms. It's to foment that grassroots movements. Barnaby Joyce put together 50 of them, put them in touch with each other to try and foment more of this opposition. And that's a seat-by-seat strategy to try and whip up some anger over this. Now, if you're going to do that, then you have to have a plausible story to tell about what you're going to do if you're stopping all of that progress towards a renewables transition. And the cover story was, until very recently, small modular reactors. They were going to be the thing. And Ted O'Brien, Peter Dutton, it was all small modular reactors. Now that's okay, except they don't exist in any workable form. The most promising project in the world, NuScale in the US, fell over when they realised that the costs were simply blowing out and it was not going to be commercial. So now they've fallen back. Well, we've got to have some holding story to tell about why we're going to stop this renewable transition and why we're going to keep relying on coal-fired power in the meantime. So now it's giant, 1950s scale plants, which, as you say, David, take decades to build, billions to cost. They're not competitive because Australia already has by far the cheapest solar energy in the world. You're going to bring in this, and who spends the billions?
Unlike the small ones, these are in commercial operation, at least the new generation plants, the large-scale ones. Peter Dutton's and Ted O'Brien's point is, if all these other countries can do it, why can't we? Is that a persuasive argument that the rest of the world seems to be okay with this?
Well, I do think that people will take pause to think about where the playing field lands now, and there has been recent polling which has suggested that particularly younger generations are more open to this conversation because they weren't necessarily aware of some of the shocking things that have happened in terms of the way nuclear power plants have ended up causing serious harm in the past. So more open to the conversation and more open to perhaps where this goes forward. But really, the biggest problem for the coalition seems to be, say if they get this argument up in the public consciousness, then they win government, that they would actually have to deliver on it. And it would be incredibly difficult to make that work in reality as opposed to principle. But it is a campaign point. It's somewhere where they can have a real point of difference, and it has excited the base. And they needed to do that. Yeah,
well, their base has been on about nuclear for years and years. So Peter Dutton finally going there, you're right, will certainly impress the base. Time to talk to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, about all of this. We're going to start, though, with the vehicle emissions standard. The consultation period over the government's proposal has just wrapped up, as I mentioned. 3 options were put forward. It's that Goldilocks one in the middle that the Minister prefers. Here's how it would work. From the start of next year, car makers would have to start gradually lowering the emissions of their entire fleet. They can still sell heavy-emitting utes and 4-wheel drives, but if they aren't also selling enough electric and low emissions vehicles below the standard to balance that out, they'll have to buy credits from those who are. And that cost will either have to be absorbed or passed on to consumers. Plenty of other countries have similar schemes. They've helped drive more electric vehicles into their markets, but industry is worried about the level of ambition here, a 60% reduction in emissions in just 5 years. And the opposition leader, well, he's been popping up at car dealerships every week to make this point.
Under Labor, people will pay $14,500 more for a Hilux. People just can't afford in their budgets to find another $14,000 or $18,000 under Mr Albanese's new ute tax and new family car tax.
Chris Bowen, welcome to the program.
G'day, David.
So can you just clear this up? Will a Toyota Hilux cost more to buy under your plans?
No, that hasn't happened anywhere else in the world, and why would it happen in Australia? And you don't have to take my word for it. When the previous government tried this in 2015 and 16 and 17, Paul Fletcher, who was driving it, was very, very clear. He made the point that the price of utes has not gone up in any other country in the world that has done it, including the United States, and that utes have remained as popular after the introduction of vehicle efficiency standards than before. This is just a ridiculous scare campaign from Peter Dutton. Peter Dutton is arguing that Australians deserve less choice and should be paying more for more petrol. He can make that argument if he wishes. The government chooses to make the argument that it's about time Australia catches up with the rest of the world and gives Australians better choices. A
lot of those other schemes, though, overseas that you mentioned did start very gradually. The US one didn't really ramp up for some years. And eventually then over a decade we did see car prices going up higher than the inflation rate. Do you acknowledge that this is a bit different, what you're proposing here, an immediate impact?
Well, I'd make a couple of points, David. Firstly, our scheme actually in 2025 is less onerous than the FCAI, the peak group body's voluntary standard. We are requiring less of them than they purport to be doing themselves. It's less onerous in 2025 than Paul Fletcher's scheme was because we have designed it carefully. I'd make the other point. The only advantage and I mean the only advantage of Australia coming so late to this, when the United States did it in the 1970s, for example, is that car companies have had all this time to develop more efficient models, including EVs, but not limited to EVs. So the technology now exists and the car companies are making them. That wasn't necessarily the case in the 1970s or 80s when other countries were doing this. So that does give us some flexibility.
But for utes and four-wheel drives, there aren't that many alternative electric options available, are there?
Well, there are some, and they are improving every day.
But what do they cost?
This is all about choices, David, and what we're not doing is saying we're going to phase out any particular type of car. Some other countries and certainly some other manufacturers or some car manufacturers are going down that road. We're not. We are saying Australians have paid $4 billion more for petrol since 2016, when the previous government squibbed it, tried it to their credit, but then squibbed it to their discredit, than they would have if the previous government had followed through with their promise to deliver vehicle efficiency standards. So we're going to deliver them.
But has any country attempted what you're suggesting, a 60% reduction in emissions in just 5 years?
Well, as I said, David, every country has different approaches.
Has anyone done this?
Well, as I said, we are coming at it very, very late, so we have other options. We've put our preferred option out there, Catherine King and I, for consultation. As I said, it starts very, very slow because we are, as I said, less onerous than the peak car group's purported voluntary model. So we are requiring them to do less than they say they will do. We're requiring them to do less than Paul Fletcher and Josh Frydenberg wanted them to do.
But it doesn't sound like anywhere in the world has asked them to do as much in 5 years as you are.
And then we want them to improve because we have so much catching up to do, David. You know, it was on your program here 2 years ago, almost to the day, that Josh Frydenberg, the then Treasurer of Australia, Liberal Party Treasurer of Australia, said the Liberal Party has always been committed to fuel efficiency standards because they reduce running costs for motorists and they reduce emissions. Now, the Liberal Party has gone so backwards on a Peter Dutton's watch and so negative that they now oppose our policies and they oppose their own. Well, we are just going to get on with the job. Every big reform can be subject to a scare campaign. Any big reform worth doing is subject to a scare campaign. That's been the case for reforms in Australia over the last 40 years. This one's no different, but this is an important reform.
No, let's look at what the industry's saying. Most of them, apart from the electric car makers, are worried about the scale of ambition here. Toyota and Mazda say it's too ambitious. Nissan says it wants a delay. Isuzu says if brands can't lift prices, they might leave the market. Even Hyundai says the start date of January is probably asking too much of industry. Are you listening to that feedback?
Well, I'd make, again, a couple of points, David. Firstly, I don't quite agree with the premise of your question. If you look at what Hyundai, Kia, Volvo, Volkswagen, and this week Nissan have said, they all support option B, which is the government's preferred option.
With changes, though, not unamended.
No, well, but their fundamental starting point is that they agree with our preferred model, and indeed the majority of submissions that Catherine King and I have received either agree with our preferred model or call for us to go harder and faster. But I'd make this point too, and maybe I could just look 30 seconds in the future and predict you're about to ask me, what our response to the consultation will be on various options, which would be unedifying viewing for our viewers, because I'm not going to get into announcing things. What I will say is the principle. Catherine and I chose to consult. We didn't have to. We could have just introduced this legislation. We chose to consult because we want to make sure we've hoovered up all the good ideas about how to implement this. So where an idea has been made to us sensibly, we will consider it sensibly, in good faith, to help the implementation of what is a big and complicated policy space. If people come along and say, listen, we understand why you're trying to do this, and here's our idea as to how you could do it most easily, and how whether it's dealers or other people, how we could most sensibly comply, of course. Where it's been designed to help us implement this and enhance the implementation, of course, the Prime Minister runs, and Catherine and I take an approach of consultation, of careful collaboration with industry. We are not going to be sort of bullied out of proceeding with a policy which is in the best interest of the Australian people, and nor would the Australian people want us to. And again, if Peter Dutton wants to go to the next election saying Australians should continue to pay more for petrol, like they have $4 billion more since the government he was a member of squibbed it in 2017, that's a matter for him.
Well, just to pick up on what you've just said there, you are willing to make sensible and good faith changes. Have you heard sensible and good faith suggestions through this process?
Again, I'm not going to sort of start ruling in or out or making announcements, but yes, of course, there have been people of goodwill, both in the industry and elsewhere, who said, we agree with your ambition, we agree with what you're trying to do, and here's some ideas about how we think the implementation could be done as smoothly as possible. Of course,
Okay.
that's been my approach in every portfolio I've had. That's Catherine's approach. You work with people to achieve the government's objectives.
And I fear what sort of answer I'm going to get here, but nonetheless, I'll throw
I might have just predicted it, David. I might have just predicted the question and the answer.
One of the suggestions is you should, like the US does, include more energy efficient air conditioning and other technology in the vehicle. Would you do that?
Well, there's various views out there about credits, super credits they're called, in various forms. Again, I'm not going to get into that in any detail.
Right.
Catherine and I are working through the submissions. We'll have more to say. We will take a sensible approach, but we will be continuing.
I'll try one more though. The big four-wheel drives, like the Ford Everest and the Land Cruisers and so on, that are classed along with the small runabouts, would you put those with the utes that are in the light commercial vehicle class rather than the passenger vehicle class?
So you're right, David. We have two classes of vehicles, passenger and light commercial, because we recognise that tradies and other small businesses have special needs. That's why we were less onerous on those types of vehicles, even less strict than the United States standard on those types of vehicles. But again, if people have sensible suggestions about where the lines are drawn, we'll consider it in good faith.
Okay, so you might class... The Everest is the same as the Ford Ranger, I think, in their drivetrain.
Yeah.
So you might put them in the same class?
Let's not go down the road of you asking me lots of questions, which I give you the same answer to every time.
Just the big picture, though. Are you willing to budge on the overall ambition here, which is a 60% reduction in emissions in 5 years?
Australia has a lot of catching up to do, and Australian motorists have been missing out on choices, and so we want to deliver those better choices as soon as is practical, and that is the approach we'll continue to take. That's why we're doing this. We're not doing this for fun, you know. We're not going out looking for a fight. We are looking for ways to improve the best interests of Australian motorists.
But do you have to hit that emissions reduction, which is I think 100 million tonnes by 2035? Do you need to achieve that here, or is there some wiggle room on that?
Well, the fuel efficiency standards play not much of a role in our 2030 targets because Australian cars stay on the road for so long, and because we're not starting until 2025, it's only about 6 million tonnes between now and 2030. Of course, that makes 100 million tonnes contribution by 2035, but we are doing this for better choices, for lower running costs and for fewer emissions and better health, because a better atmosphere, fewer particulates in the air is better for Australians' health. This is win-win-win.
Let's turn to nuclear energy. You might have just heard the opposition says experts are telling them you could have a nuclear power plant up and running within 10 years in Australia. Is that right?
Tell him he's dreaming. I mean, I don't know what experts he's talking to. I mean, I just heard you talking about Europe's experience. I could point to the United States' experience. The United States, with a very developed regulatory regime, with a very developed nuclear industry, the nuclear leader of the world. The average build time of a nuclear power plant in the United States has been 19 years. Ted O'Brien thinks you can do it in Australia from 10 with a standing start, with no regulations, with it banned not only nationally but in the 3 most popular states. I mean, throw in the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge and you might sell him something.
The ban that we have on nuclear energy, if the idea of nuclear energy is so prohibitively expensive, takes too long, why do we need the ban at all?
Well, David, I hear this argument about, oh, just lift the ban and let the market sort it out. Well, the market hasn't sorted it out in any other country in the world. Every country in the world with nuclear has required massive transfers of taxpayer wealth to the nuclear constructors. Now, if we were to go down that road in Australia, we'd really be sending the signal that we're prepared to do that we are prepared to use taxpayers' money to subsidise the development of the nuclear industry, and we're not.
Just in fairness, though, Minister, you do. I mean, the government's building Snowy 2.0. You have the scheme, the capacity investment scheme that subsidises renewables. We don't know how much that's costing.
Well, very different approaches. I mean, you look at now the opposition has scrapped their small modular reactor policy after we've been telling them for 2 years there is no such thing as a small modular reactor. They've scrapped it and gone for large. The poster child of large nuclear reactors is Hinkley C in the United Kingdom, which is very, very late and has come in at $86 billion for a 3 gigawatt, just over 3 gigawatt nuclear power plant. Now, coal in Australia is about 22 gigawatts. Do the maths. I mean, this is eye-watering amounts of government taxpayer subsidy that would be required to make this stack up. Maybe Peter Dutton's prepared to do that. We're not.
So, but if you lifted the ban now, surely you could go to the election sometime early next year and say, look, no one's interested. We lifted the ban 12 months on. not a jot of interest. Wouldn't that strengthen your argument?
Well, again, it would send mixed signals, and it would send the signal that the government's somehow interested in sending subsidies. I've had no one knock on my door to say I want to build a nuclear power plant in Australia. But I've had plenty of the world's biggest renewable companies through my door. This is not happening. There's a myth that this is happening elsewhere in the world. It's not. Australia has the best renewable resources in the world. It would be a massive economic own goal to give up utilising those resources and to go down this nuclear fantasy.
But it is happening in other parts of the world. The coalition often make this point. And you were at the COP summit in Dubai, where I think it was 22 nations signed up to a pledge to triple nuclear capacity to, along with renewables, meet their net zero targets.
Well, triple by 2050, 22 countries, whereas 123 countries pledged to triple renewables by 2030, just 6 years away. And, you know, David, if you look at the amount of nuclear that's been added in the last year, it's 1% of what's been added in renewables. The world is moving to renewables in a massive way. We added more renewables in the last calendar year across the planet than the entire capacity of the world's nuclear fleet that had been built up over decades.
What about the example Peter Dutton often gives of Ontario, the Canadian province, where he says they use a lot of nuclear, 60% nuclear, and their bills are a lot lower than they are here?
It's a cool story, isn't it? It's just not true is the only problem with it. I mean, two things about Ontario. One, what Mr Dutton doesn't tell you is the Ontario state government subsidises energy bills in Ontario by $6 billion Canadian a year. If he's planning to do that, he better tell us sometime soon. Secondly, look at Quebec, the province next door to Ontario, which is 98% renewable. Their power prices are less than half what they are in Ontario, which is predominantly nuclear. The problem is with all Mr Dutton and Mr O'Brien's claims on nuclear, when you put scrutiny on them, they crumble like a sayo in a blender. They just don't stack up.
All right. Just while you're in fact-checking mode, the other figure that he's been using this week, that the renewables and the poles and wires required under your plan is going to eventually cost $1 trillion. What is it going to cost?
Oh, I really don't know where Mr Dutton gets that claim from. He's making it up. Here's a tip, if you're an electrician, go around and quote for some work in Mr Dutton's house, because he'll pay whatever. He'd be paying $100 million a kilometre for transmission. I mean, you could build the transmission towers in gold and do the wires in pearls and it wouldn't cost that much. I really don't know what Kool-Aid he's drinking where he's come up with those figures.
Well, what is the cost?
Well, the best guide to the cost is AEMO's Integrated Systems Plan, which, if you like, looked at this in 2024 dollars, in current dollars, looked at the total cost out to 2050 of the entire generation, storage and transmission, and came up at $121 billion.
All right, and a final one on household bills. The next couple of weeks, the Australian Energy Regulator will release its default price ruling for the coming financial year, so from July. As Minister, what do you think? Should household prices, retail prices go down?
Well, this, of course, we will see this in a couple of weeks, you're right, David. This is, of course, what Angus Taylor changed the law to hide before the last election when it showed a 20% increase. I'm not going to get out in front of the Australian Energy Regulator, who's independent, but, you know, me and the state ministers have provided our feedback to the regulator in the normal course of events as to what should be prioritised. You would expect us to have prioritised consumers, and we have, me and the state colleagues. I think you will see, again, I'm not going to preempt, but I think you'll see a few things playing out. You'll see the impact of our coal and gas caps, you'll see the impact of cheaper renewables, and you'll see some of the pressure coming off from international markets. We'll all get to talk about it in a couple of weeks. I'm not going to preempt the work of Claire Savage, the very fine Australian Energy Regulator.
It sounds a bit like, Minister, you're expecting prices to come down, as you promised at the election they would.
Well, I'm not here announcing the default market offer. It will be released in a normal, public and transparent manner. I won't be changing the law to hide it, like Angus Taylor did. It'll be out there for all to see in a couple of weeks, and perhaps we can have a chat about it then. But there are certainly indications that what we are doing is providing what we want it to, which is, of course, more relief to consumers.
All right, Chris Bowen, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure, David.
Coming up, we're going to look at the ASEAN summit that was held in Melbourne during the week and the different views among some of the regional leaders when it comes to the role of China in the region. First, let's just continue this conversation. Back to our panel, Jennifer Hewett, Peter Hartcher and Anna Henderson. Just want to pick up on a couple of things there. On the vehicle emission standards, Jennifer, it does sound like sensible and good faith changes might be coming.
Yes, I really took from that he's prepared to make some compromises. Whether it'll be enough to satisfy the industry is another thing. But I think he was definitely signalling movement there, but saying we'll stick with the principle.
Yeah, and look, we'll see. They need to legislate this this year, but you would think the sooner the better, given it's got a start date of January and has a big impact on a big industry, Peter. But did that sound like the Minister warming up for some change?
Absolutely. Well, and I said it at the outset, I fully expect that they will tweak it, and he's just confirmed that. So,
what about the overall?
Yeah, I said I won't be bullied.
No,
but I will listen to reasonable suggestions.
Yeah,
he'll be practical.
I'll be practical.
The big question is, does that 60% emissions reduction over 5 years, which is the scale of ambition, does that change? He left that open too.
And the other question, of course, will be in the Senate, where the Greens will play havoc with this too.
Correct, because there's no way the opposition, I don't think, would vote for even an amended version of this. So they'll have to work with the Greens. How difficult does that become? And just on nuclear power, clearly dismissing various things the coalition have said, but standing by the ban remaining in place. I think, Jennifer, you touched on it earlier. Is there an argument to keep that moratorium in place?
I mean, the idea of the Labor Party knowing what they stand for and what the party membership would expect lifting that ban is probably a bridge too far, I would say.
You wouldn't get it through the branches.
You can't imagine that'd be at all popular. And at this point, I think from the way the Minister's talking, he's ready for that fight. And he's got some lines polished up and ready to go.
He does. Labor's
compare him to Ted O'Brien, you can see there is a difference in the sophistication of the arguments here, but which cuts through will be the question.
Yeah, Labor will relish an argument, an election campaign over nuclear. Won't they, Peter?
Well, and that's that. So they've got two fights here. Remember, they've got to deal with the proposals and scare campaigns from the coalition, but they've got to remember the Greens are there as well. So to abandon the moratorium on nuclear in Australia would give the Greens an attack point where the Greens could attack from the left and say, look, Labor's clearly gearing up to betray you and give the green light to the nuclear industry. So they have to keep the moratorium in place, but they're certainly not going to kowtow to the Liberals on nuclear.
Let's turn to some other issues. Figures out during the week showed the economy slowed almost to a halt in the final 3 months of last year. Still growth in positive territory, but only just 0.2%, 1.5% of growth for the year. Slow growth better than no growth, said the Treasurer. I guess he's right about that. He is signalling, however, that the government is keeping an eye on this growth situation.
Addressing inflation is still our primary concern, but these numbers show that the balance of risks in our economy are shifting from inflation to growth.
Jennifer, what does that mean? Is the government warming up to spend some money to support growth?
Yes, the government is warming up to spend some money to support growth. There's no doubt about that. They're very anxious about it, and as they should be. I mean, those figures are very, very poor. And of course, as you said, yes, it's still growth and positive, but not on a per person basis.
No, per capita we're still in
per capita we're still in recession, and that's what people are complaining about. So exactly how they do it, they won't want to do too much, but they'll want to kind of assuage some of the resentments in the community, while also kind of keeping the inflation thing going. But there'll be a lot of demands for more money, and so Jim Chalmers is going to find it harder, even than he has in the past, to kind of keep that at bay. And he's clearly signalling he's aware of the problem now in terms of keeping it going. But productivity and stuff, it's improved a little bit, but it's still pretty lousy. So I'm not quite sure how we're going to get there without
inflation is coming down, which is great, but it's still too high. It's still above the Reserve Bank's target zone. Should the Treasurer, the government, be waiting until the Reserve Bank at least starts cutting interest rates before it starts spending?
Well, that's the big short-term action. It's to get a quick response to growth. You deal with interest rates, and that's the Reserve Bank's job. You don't ramp up discretionary spending through the budget. That would let the inflation genie back out, and then the Reserve Bank would have to slow the pace of interest rate cuts, which then frustrates everybody. So if Jim Chalmers is lining up for a major expansion of discretionary spending, it's a self-defeating policy.
I doubt he's going to go that far.
So I doubt that too. But what they will do, and what they've signalled they'll do, is do what they did in the last budget, and that is give cost of living relief in the form of subsidies or price cuts, so power prices, childcare. They'll do more of that because it doesn't stoke.
It's going to put downward pressure on inflation too.
Yeah,
Wouldn't that be helpful too with the election promise they took around power bills going down? Just a neat little way to get at least closer to that promise, perhaps that they would deliver on by next year, or that the market in conjunction would deliver on around that $275 decrease in power bills that up until now it seemed like absolute pie in the sky that they would ever be able to achieve.
Handy timing, wouldn't it?
It would.
Can I just throw in one other thought? Yeah. The thing that Jim Chalmers has to concentrate on is the fact that we are in what the former Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department, Martin Parkinson, called a permanent slow-motion recession. Australia needs economic reform. It doesn't need just more spending, just more stoking. It needs systemic reform to lift business investment and to lift productivity across the whole nation. Australia got 30 years of above-average growth out of the Hawke-Keating and to some extent the Howard-Costello years, their reforms. They're exhausted. We need a new generation, and that's Chalmers' primary focus. It shouldn't be on more spending.
But I'm not sure it may be his primary focus, but I don't think we've seen much evidence of exactly how that will be.
No
I can't see that.
We've seen
that
no
he's really interested in that, to be honest.
There was one spending measure announced during the week to coincide with International Women's Day, and that was a long-held Labor ambition to pay superannuation on paid parental leave. But Anna, this won't take effect until July next year. So even if you're pregnant now, you're not going to see that super for a while.
But a handy signal for the Labor Party to send out, a handy decision to make, one that really most people, I think, in the sector have been expecting was going to happen at some point in time, because Labor's values suggest that it would support this. And it does give them as well, I'm sure this wasn't, the major decision-making lead for this policy, but it helped to frame up Labor's focus on women and women's rights, and not just women on parental leave, but certainly a lot of women are the primary caregiver. In the same week that the coalition had pre-selected another bloke in a winnable seat.
I'm going to come back to that issue, but sticking with the coalition, just in their reaction to this, they started the day saying, not so sure, this is a welfare payment. By the end of the day, Susan Lee, Angus Taylor put out a statement saying, no, we do back it in principle. The next day, Peter Dutton was again saying, we're going to wait and see the detail in the budget before we make a call on this. So when it comes to new spending, they often like to, criticise the government for spending too much, but you can see the difficulty they have in opposing something like this.
They just don't want to be in a space where they're stopping people from putting money in their pockets, given that's what they say is their main proviso and obligation in opposition. So, but
particularly when it affects women.
Yeah.
The Greens announced a new housing plan during the week. The idea is to build 360,000 private dwellings. Well, they'd be built by the government, but then over 5 years, sold onto the private market, rented on the private market. And it would be a first in, first best approach. You have to show some connection to the suburb, but then basically, whoever gets in first with their application would be lucky enough. The Grattan Institute called this a lottery. Peter, how do you think this idea stacks up?
Well, they've left out a couple of little details, haven't they? For example, where they're going to get the land from, the fact that the states control all of the policy and all of the zoning and all of the land issues that you need for development are state issues. So you're going to have this, according to this policy, which is fundamentally unworkable, you're going to have this giant lumbering new federal thing coming in on the top without the powers to find the land that the Greens haven't explained where they're going to
Well, just on that point, Max Chandler-Mather reckons the states would willingly sign up.
I would be very surprised if the states then turned around and said, no, we don't want tens of billions of dollars investment in good quality housing in our states.
Well, the states would have to provide the land, but also give up stamp duty as well under this plan. Yeah. You can see in New South Wales, Chris Minns is already having a hell of a time with his plans to get more density into Sydney, fighting the councils over that. So you're not as confident the states would sign up to this as well.
It's completely unworkable. And Emma Dawson from the Per Capita think tank said that this isn't a policy. These are campaign lines.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this is.
Well, I think it's the kind of version of political fairy floss, really. You kind of get a lot of sugar, you spin it up so it all looks very attractive, nice colours, and it's absolutely got no substance and it's very bad for you.
All right, well, dealt with that one then. ASEAN, Melbourne played host to a gathering of regional leaders during the week, this special ASEAN summit. Second time Australia's done this. They were all here apart from Myanmar. Talked a lot about trade, talked a lot about strengthening ties in the region. But Peter, you've called this ASEAN grouping a play group. Rather unkind. Why?
Well, this morning I heard Don Farrell, the Trade Minister, describe ASEAN as an ally, a great ally of Australia. Well, that's pretty strange because it's not an alliance, it is a play group. And in its 54 years of existence, or whatever it is, ASEAN has utterly and quite deliberately failed to deal with any major crisis, whether it's the Asian financial crisis, the military coup in Myanmar. They're completely ineffectual and they like it that way. They only get together for fun things, maybe a bit more trade, a bit more investment. They love the karaoke, but they're not good with crises.
Play groups, I'm sure, as most young parents will agree, can be worthwhile exercises.
Oh, they're great.
Building ties, relationships,
yes.
very different households.
Yes, all right,
yes.
well.
And keeping the peace and keeping investment going, fastest growing region in the world. You know, they're all pretty good achievements to have.
There's been no conflict between ASEAN members for 50 years.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah, while, yes, you know, they don't necessarily achieve a lot politically in signalling. They have very different viewpoints. That there was this sense from the week that once again the lines of communication are open. We don't know what is necessarily said in those rooms and those bilateral meetings on the sidelines where Australia got the chance to host and potentially send some, diplomatically charged signals.
Well, we know China looms large over this region. There are some different views amongst the ASEAN leaders. We heard from Singapore's Prime Minister support for Australia going down the path of these AUKUS nuclear submarines.
When the Australian new submarines are ready, we welcome them to visit Changi Naval Base in due course.
There you go. On the other hand, though, you've got Malaysia's Prime Minister basically pushing back at the criticism of China.
We do not want to be dictated by any force. So whilst we remain to be an important friend to the United States or Europe and here in Australia, they should not preclude us from being friendly to one of our important neighbours, precisely China. And that was the context. And if they have problems with China, they should not impose it upon us. We do not have a problem with China.
We do not have a problem with China. How were those different positions on China, Anna, reflected in the final communique from the meeting?
By an extremely watered down set of lines, which didn't really speak to any of the more challenging and difficult parts of this conversation. And I think also in that press conference with the Malaysian Prime Minister, when he was asked about the question about the Middle East conflict, he actually said, look, there'll be areas that we can agree on, and then the rest, it's just too difficult. We're not going to, go any further. And that's what happened with China as well. And while we were there in the media centre, covering the events during the week, there was actually a collision between a Chinese and a Filipino.
What about the timing of that? I know that this has been happening a fair bit, but is there a view that this might have been timed while this ASEAN meeting's underway? China's having a confrontation at sea with the Philippines?
And a week after that very, very strong statement to the Australian Parliament by the Philippines President as well. Very, very unusually for an ASEAN country, very antagonistic towards China.
I don't think it was designed to be intentionally coincidental because the Chinese Coast Guard and Navy and maritime militia are permanently on watch to intercept resupply from the Philippines to the boat that they keep as a territory marker to ward China off this super sensitive. This is the cutting edge now of Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea. It's called Second Thomas Shoal off the coast of the Philippines. So it just happened that was the day the Philippines were trying to resupply the troops that they keep on this boat as a marker, a territorial marker to ward off China. Just happened to be the day when the leaders are all gathering in Melbourne for ASEAN. So, that was the same day when the Chinese boats rammed Filipino boats, used their water cannon. I mean, this is classic. It's very successful. It's brilliantly tactical strategy, brilliantly tactical tactic to use where they use force just below the level of kinetic warfare, but high pressure water cannon blast the windows out of the Philippines resupply boat. They do all that stuff. But what did we hear? But what did we hear from the ASEAN leaders gathered in Melbourne? crickets.
Well, that's true. But I think the other thing that we didn't hear from the ASEAN leaders, but which is still very true, they don't want to offend China. They also want Chinese investment, but they also want, despite what Paul Keating says, they want America to remain engaged in the region on the whole, some more than others, but that is absolutely, they just don't want it to be open conflict.
Speaking of America, big week in US politics just finally. Donald Trump wrapping up the nomination virtually with big Super Tuesday wins. Joe Biden delivering a State of the Union address. It was really a campaign speech beginning his campaign. He really went in punching, told Congress to keep supporting Ukraine, basically had a crack at Donald Trump and his strange fondness for Vladimir Putin. He went to the abortion rights as well very strongly. He tried to deal with the immigration issue, which is a problem for him. And he even took on the big concern facing his re-election, and that is his age.
I know it may not look like it, but I've been around a while. When you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever. I know the American story. Again and again, I've seen the contest between competing forces in the battle for the soul of our nation. Between those who want to pull America back to the past and those who want to move America into the future.
Look, it was a pretty fiery speech. At the end of the day, though, the American voters, Anna, seem pretty unimpressed with the choice on offer at this election.
Yeah, one of the assessments of the actual State of the Union address was, did he have energy? Like, it wasn't really about what he said, but was he energetic?
Yeah, what was the vibe?
Did he have the sense of being able to deliver, and could he do the full campaign? But yes, there's this concept in the US of the double haters, the voters who are not enthused with either option. Nobody knows how they'll eventually fall or if they'll get out to vote at all, but that it's just not energising them, it's not interesting them, this debate.
A rerun election, but Donald Trump's ahead in the polls right now, Peter.
He is, but what will ultimately decide this is turnout, and what turns people out to vote are red-hot political issues. So on the Democrat side, it's abortion, and on the Republican side, it's immigration, and they're the big anger points that each side will promote to get turnout. That's the critical thing, and it won't in the end be Joe Biden's age or Donald Trump's.
We will see. We will see. I just wanted to mention, you talked about the Liberals pre-selecting another man in Cook to replace Scott Morrison. Paul Sakal reported over the weekend that two other Liberal frontbenchers Peter Dutton is trying to save because they're under pre-selection challenge, and Ruston in South Australia and Melissa McIntosh in New South Wales, they're facing pre-selection challenges from Liberal Party members. Meanwhile, I understand on Friday night, which incidentally it was International Women's Day, the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party voted on their new state executive. There were 4 vice president positions up for grab. All 4 went to men. So their state conference is going to be dominated by a federal leader, state president, and 4 vice presidents, all men. Look, anyway, I had a really interesting chat with Charlotte Mortlock. She is the founder of the Hilmers Network, which is trying to boost the number of women in the Liberal Party's federal ranks. We spoke about why this is happening, what the structural problems are, what needs to change to get more women pre-selected and into Parliament for the Liberals. You can check out that podcast, a couple of QR codes there, the one on the left for the ABC Listen app, the one on the right if you want to watch us on the ABC iView. All right, our panel, Anna Henderson, Peter Hartcher and Jennifer Hewett, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with Associate Professor Andrew Meares from the ANU School of Cybernetics, and a very warm welcome back.
Hi, Mike.
After the dunking at Dunkley, the cartoonists were keen to draw their own conclusions.
All data is animated by a narrative, and didn't they have a happy story to tell?
It was almost like when concession was conquest. Did you see the speech? It was like Reverse World. Yeah, we lost. Lovely Mark Knight cartoon. I'm here to deliver a really strong message to Albo from the voters of Dunkley. You win. The message was that even in the middle of a cost of living crisis with multiple figure rate rises, we still can't win back our seat.
Better luck in the general election.
Yeah, better luck in the general election. Lovely Megan Herbert cartoon. She's drawn Anthony Albanese here as some sort of Batman, I suppose. He must be Tax Cut Man, who's reading the signs in the sky. Holy broken promises, Tax Cut Man.
It's one way to draw attention to your policies.
Yeah.
Searchlights.
Matt Golding, the Dunkley result means both sides can claim a win. For the Libs, Dutton's leadership is secure, and for Labor, Dutton's leadership is secure. Yeah, they shouldn't wish too hard for a change of coalition leadership, right?
You'd rather go with the status quo.
Go with the status quo. Kathy Wilcox has picked up on this, Andrew.
Dunkley debrief. So, fear campaigns alone don't seem to be working for you. You might need some actual policies. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I know. Let's put plutonium into our electrics.
Kaboom!
I mean, isn't that just like, this is your first policy, and it's like, yes, let's go the nuclear option.
Every TLC gets a reactor.
Susan Lee and Peter Dutton here, and he seems to be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
I've got a feeling David Rowe is the iceberg. I mean, no ship is getting past him, especially the HMSS Titanic.
HMAS SS Titanic.
Oh, he's mean.
I did love this David Pope cartoon. It's drawing on the Homer mobile. I don't know if you saw the Homer Simpson mobile, but it's the coalition ute, the opposition policy ute, dual cab biospheres with Susan and the Nats in the back, small modular nuclear reactor, and apologies to Homer Simpson.
So he's really the attention to detail here that the Nats and the Libs cannot breathe the same air.
Yeah,
like
I know. When you need to find the longest way around, they've redacted that.
Yeah, and the road of crushed solar panels. Oh.
Matt Golding has got both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton as extremists on the bridge at Melbourne, blocking the solar traffic here. Beep, beep, extremists, honk.
There's a whole lot of lobbyists in this building that battle is playing out, and so creating futures is often about what you negate, what you say no to.
There are lobbyists in this building?
Apparently.
Really? The wonderful Alan Moyer has captured it perfectly here. It's like, so all we need is volunteers for the nuclear power sites, and the backbenchers here are leaping through the window. That comes down to it. It's like, what part of Dixon do you want to put this in, Peter?
Look at the way Alan gets the temporality here. Like, this chair's about to fall. We've got the smoke, the newspaper, and then so we've got a before, during, and after, all in one frame. It's just so clever.
Yeah. It's very good. This week, the US had Super Tuesday, and unsurprisingly, the Republicans have come up trumps.
I don't know, I feel like I've seen this movie before, and it's not going to end well.
Yeah. Andrew, here's David Rowe doing what only David Rowe can do, appalling us and delighting us all at the same time. It's the race for the Twilight House.
Like the ice cream the aviators. Come on, man.
I love David. He always puts me, the people, on the front of it here and there. Uncle Sam having a little bit of a sob over here.
Yeah, here we go again.
Here we go again. Andrew, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mike. Just before we get some final observations from you guys, quick mention of the terrible news the other day. The son of former Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon, who died in a Special Forces training accident. Lance Corporal Jack Fitzgibbon was in the 2nd Commando Regiment. His dad says his family's devastated but very proud of their son, as they should be, who loved being part of the Special Forces. So our thoughts with the whole Fitzgibbon family. Anna.
Yeah, incredibly sad. Look, SBS has just finished an investigation into foreign interference, Jen Shearer, the reporter, and this week, when these bilateral meetings are being held, some of those countries have been accused of serious foreign interference and very sinister behaviour. Now, the Prime Minister's office says that the way that it was discussed potentially in the room was about sovereignty being upheld and respected. Well, a lot of these community groups are hoping the language was much stronger when they had those meetings.
Interesting. Peter.
In the US, the Congress is about to have a vote on whether to ban the app TikTok on the basis that, because it's Chinese-owned and controlled, it's a national security risk. It's going to make it relevant here and put it back on the agenda here. It's a tough one, because do you have a security risk? And if so, what do you do about the most popular app in the country?
Jennifer.
Well, less than a year ago, the government was promoting critical minerals as our big new growth story, and for domestic manufacturing as well. The collapse in the price of nickel and lithium, amongst others, has demonstrated how fragile it is, and the industry is crying out for help against that and against continued Chinese dominance. One more dilemma for the government and Jim Chalmers on how much to intervene.
Indeed, it is. Look, thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, much has been said about the lack of civility in politics lately, so it's good to see one of our own Insiders panellists, Shane Wright, doing his bit to bring a bit of courtesy to proceedings in what's become something of a ritual whenever the Treasurer starts a press conference. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Treasurer. Hello, Shane. Thanks for coming. Where's Shane? Oh, good morning, Shane. You ready, Shane?
I'm ready. Are you?
Thank you, Shane. You know you missed the last one. Always count on Shane. Hello, Shane. Sorry to keep you waiting. Shane, you've appointed Shane spokesman for the group. That's a wise choice.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.